The House Agriculture Committee meeting. It's all right.
You're welcome.
Apologize for the tardiness, but as we know, when constituents come from long ways away, we want to make sure we at least have a couple of minutes to hear what's on their mind, and so we appreciate your patience in this. Another big day. We had a big day yesterday with commodity groups, and today I think it's going to be equally as insightful as what's going on in Kansas agriculture. But first, we're going to have bill introductions. We're going to ask for those, and first up, we'll call on Leo Henning from KDHE. Welcome to committee.
Hello?
Yes.
All right. Oh, good afternoon, Chairman Rogers and committee members. My name's Leo Henning. I'm the Deputy Secretary and Director of Environment at the Kansas Department of Health and Environment. And thank you for allowing me today to introduce a bill for our Bureau of Water. The RS number is 0343. This bill does two things. It creates a new maximum fee for underground injection wells for our underground injection control program. And the second thing it does is it allows fees that are collected by our operator certification and water well contractor programs to remain with those two programs. So that's what the bill does.
Thank you. Any questions? Seeing none, the bill will be entered. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, before we get to the main presentation, I do want to take I guess, a point of chairman's privilege, if you will, and welcome a very special guest who has been in the state almost a year, but is doing so far, I would say, pretty good things, especially his coaching job he did Tuesday night. The president of Kansas State University, Dr. Richard Linton. So. He comes from North Carolina State, which doesn't know much about agriculture, so he wanted to make sure he would get a good insight. I think he heard, Rogers, how'd they make you chairman of anything, let alone something as important as agriculture? So, Dr. Linton, thank you so much for being here. Thank you for your willingness to listen to average Kansans like me and others, and just the way you have kind of re-inspired the university in so many communities. We were waiting for a spark. We dearly appreciate what the General Myers did for K-State all these years. But as your colleague beside you, Dr. Peterson, would know, how many times did I say the next president better be all about the land grant mission? So we're glad you're here. So thank you so much. Thank you. I guess before I got ahead of myself, any other bill introductions? I don't believe there was, or there are. See, my language is very good. Okay. All right, so let's go as something annually that happens every year. We get to hear from the Secretary of Agriculture, and so yet again, we're pleased to welcome Mike Beam, who is the Kansas Secretary of Agriculture. Mr. Secretary, thanks for being here.
Well, thank you. It's a real privilege as your Ag Secretary to come visit with the House Ag Committee. With me today, I didn't introduce these folks this morning before the Senate Ag and Natural Resources Committee, but I'm really blessed to have these people at our office helping the state and our Ag Department, but Deputy Secretary Kelsey Olson, who you will see more of probably during this session than myself. We have our Communications Director or Public Information Officer, Heather Lansdowne, and she's also very responsible for what you see before you as far as the materials. And then our CFO, our financial person, Kellen Leaps, who helps us in many ways with all things financial at the Department of Ag. So again, I have a considerable amount of material with you. I'm not going to go through it all very thoroughly. I'll go through, kind of hit the highlights. I would say, following President Linton, that we have a document that we'll provide to the Budget Committee and our Budget Committee, and we'll provide to you if you want. But we have a really strong relationship with Kansas State University not just because we're located in Manhattan, but because of many of the things that we do. The synergy is very helpful. But we have at least a 3-page draft document that we're updating that shows all the partnerships and collaborations that we do with Kansas State. And I've shared a draft with his office, and we'll polish that up and update that and get it out. But we're really proud also to be such a strong affiliation with Kansas State and Dr. Litton and his staff. So one of my roles, and it's in the statute, one of my roles as secretary is to promote Kansas agriculture. I don't know how long that's been in the statute. Basically, everything that we do has been through the years. The agency started, I think, in 1855, all through authorization or direction by the Kansas Legislature. But I like to talk to a lot of folks as I go throughout the state. Some of them are agricultural groups, but many of them are not. Many of them are civic groups. And I like to tell them about the story about agriculture as it relates in Kansas. But I think it's clearly probably the single largest industry and economic driver of this state. We've identified 73 sectors of agriculture, food processing, and food. And those sectors have a direct economic contribution to this state of $53.4 billion. If you look at induced and indirect, we reach $76 billion. So that also relates to 256,000 jobs, or about 14% of the workforce is associated with those 73 sectors. Our office, our staff also provide this documentation on a county-by-county basis. So on our website, and we can help you if you have any requests, but you can pull this data on your county and determine what are the top sectors in ag and what contribution they make locally. So we'd be glad to help you with that if you would like that. The one thing I always like to show when I go to these meetings is a heat map. It's in the packet that you have. I believe it's on page 13. This is from the 2017 agricultural census. USDA is underway now for the 22 census. But this is a snapshot of where the concentration of market value of ag products are throughout the United States. And to me, when you look at that, it's obvious that we'll see lots of economic activity in California, the Texas Panhandle, the Corn Belt. But what really sticks out to me is Kansas, and maybe more specifically, that southwest quadrant of the state. It's a big economic engine, and there's some correlation there that I'll talk about a little later that I think is significant in the discussions that you're having this year. But also on that chart is the top 10 counties, and with Haskell, Scott, and Gray in the top 3, particularly Haskell County is the big economic driver, but maybe one of the smallest population counties. So don't ever take it for granted that some of those lower population counties don't make a huge contribution. They do make a huge contribution to the state and the region. So the status of the ag economy, probably the biggest thing on the front burner concern of most people this year was the drought. It was pretty much statewide. But some of the bright spots were the grain, oilseed, and livestock markets. If you just look at the market itself, they were pretty strong in 2022. We provided some graphs, but you'll see that wheat, soybean, and corn were at, or perhaps in some cases above, historically high prices. Hog prices, fed cattle prices were significantly above the 5-year average. But the whole story and what people need to realize is farm production expenses are up at a record high level. K-State's Farm Management Association had predicted that 2022 we would have a 17.8% increase in production costs. What's scary, which is the largest year-to-year dollar increase, but what's scary is the projection potentially as much as 39% for 23 and beyond. So we have some challenges. It's not all that fun and games, but there's still lots of opportunities. And one of those is ag exports. I think you heard Governor Kelly mention this at last year's State of the State address, but it did come true. 2022, we set a record with $5.35 billion in agricultural exports from the state of Kansas. That's an increase, obviously, of previous years. Part of that, of course, is the value has increased, but the volume is definitely increased as well. Our top exports, 80% of that falls into meat, edible offal, cereals, and oilseed. Our biggest trading partners are Mexico, Japan, China, South Korea, and Taiwan. So we'll be excited to see what 2022 data shows. We'll have that, should have that available sometime later this spring. The primary way that we work with our stakeholders in helping identify the opportunities or needs for growth is through our annual Ag Growth Summit. But prior to that, we have many sessions, some of them virtual, with individual commodities or sectors to try to assess what do they see as the challenges or opportunities, and then we determine with collaboration what's most appropriate for a state agency to help in that manner. And education was a big focus across many sectors. The post-secondary opportunities, the training of students, an education system that has a strong tie to industry, and funding research, ag research. I had the opportunity to go to one of the Landon lectures where the CEO of Land O'Lakes was there, and she has a pretty good big picture of ag. And one of the top 4 things she stressed is we're way behind in our public agricultural research. And so I think that was seconded by the input that we received at our Ag Growth Summit. The other area that continues to surface, not just on the ag front, not just in rural Kansas, but workforce. Workforce availability is a key barrier to growth in this state. We have a shortage of workers for beef processing, pet food, poultry, pork, ag equipment manufacturing, ag technology, and meat processing. What was identified also at the summit, a pretty strong consensus. In fact, the panel talking about this received a round of applause, as we need reform in our immigration system, particularly as it relates to visas for agricultural workers. So we were pleased that the U.S. House passed the Federal Farm Workforce Modernization Act. It was a product of probably 100 or more coalition members and a bipartisan vote in the House. We kind of ran out of steam before the Senate to take it up, so we really hope that we can get that done, because that is very crucial for our workforce, particularly in those areas that I've mentioned previously. We did a survey in 2022 as a follow-up to the 2015 survey on workforce. An overview of that is in the materials that I provided you. But the response rate was phenomenal. I think we had over 1,900 responses. That's at least 3 times the amount of responses that we had previously. And you'll see by that there's lots of concerns, some ideas. A couple things I think that stuck out to me is amongst the responses, the areas where they identified as the most difficult for filling positions would be the CDL and equipment operators and the general labor, physical, and they call it unskilled workers. I know that's a technical term, but anybody that can show up and work and be a part of the team is, in my mind, a skilled worker. But there's definitely a need. And the other thing was noted is the biggest, most successful source of recruiting was recruiting from their peers. So I think employers need to take note, and took note of that. That's their biggest sales pitch, is the existing employees recruiting others to join the team. So I mentioned the drought. At one time, it measured on the USDA drought monitor map, I think in all 105 counties at one time, but at one point there were 67 of the counties in an emergency status. This obviously had a big negative impact in the crop production and our forage production. It also, over the last 2 years, this drought condition has increased our risk for major wildfires, which I'll touch on here in a minute. But a lot of these local communities know and understand the economic impact of agriculture, and they feel it when they get in drought conditions. But that also has highlighted even more the critical role that the Ogallala Aquifer has for a water source for a good portion of the state of Kansas, for not just agriculture, but the public water supply and water by our industry. And one of the tools or one of the implications that we've seen as we go through a hot, dry summer, at the same time as the growing season, is that there's a lot of pumping. And one of the tools that the legislature authorized several years ago is a multi-year flex account. And so we're seeing a lot of interest in individuals who did perhaps pump at or above their authorized use. They knew that if they applied by December 31, they could roll into this multi-year flex account. So we have, I think, about 650 multi-year flex accounts that came in before the end of the year that we'll be processing. The first week of January, our Division of Water Resources staff, in cooperation with the Kansas Geological Survey, go out every year and measure index wells to get a very accurate feel for the change in the water levels. And that data is, for the most part, has been collected. The Geological Survey will be finishing up with that and presenting a report sometime this spring. So one thing I like to try to remind folks is, as we look at this water debate, why it's so important, at least in my mind. Remember the heat map where I showed the strength of the ag economy and the value of ag production. That's right over the top of the Ogallala Aquifer. So I think it's difficult really to imagine how this region would look and how our entire state would be if it wasn't for the availability and the use of that water and the risks that multiple generations of farm and ranches have made and agribusinesses. So it's been a huge, huge economic impact to the state, to the region, and actually to the world in the production that's come through it. Now there seems, with good reason, to be considerable attention about the continued depletion. So I would just say that the economic viability of Kansas agriculture and rural communities is going to depend on the prolonged life of the groundwater resources of the state. So you and the Water Committee and others are going to have lots of opportunities to discuss that. But I kind of tend to be an optimist, and I believe if we really devote to trying to solve that and maybe a phased approach, that we can make a difference. But it's going to be vital for the future. That heat map will look different in 20 years from now if we don't do something. So we have a lot of interesting things that happen. 1 minute we'll be talking water, next minute we'll talk about food safety in restaurants, and then next we'll be talking about sick chickens. So I'll touch a little bit on highly pathogenic avian influenza. I'm sure most of you have heard about this in the news, or at least heard a little bit about it. But this really started up in the United States in February of last year. By now, all but 3 states have had positive incidences of this avian influenza. It's impacted over 57 million domestic birds. And that means depopulation. A lot of those were layers, and so if you wonder why your egg prices are up, it's because the avian influenza has caused the depopulation of many of the layers across the United States, particularly in states like Iowa and Minnesota, where a lot of those layers are at. We've been fortunate in comparison to other states. We've had about 20,000 birds have been impacted, I think on 13 flocks. Most of the flocks that have been impacted by this disease have been what we call backyard flocks. They haven't been the commercial flocks. But, you know, even in Johnson County, we had a flock that we had to deal with. They're all over, but in comparison to what other states have had to deal with, we've been light. And in fact, we've had some assistance from a few other state veterinarians, particularly Nebraska just helped us out recently with a game bird flock with helping with the equipment that we didn't have available at the time. What's changed the situation is when we had avian influenza in the United States, I think it was in 2015, that was a situation where the disease was spreading from domestic flock to domestic flock. It looks like in this case, almost always, it looks like the source of it is from wild birds, and you'll see the numbers start peaking in the migratory season. So last spring, as birds were moving south, you know, the disease started popping up across the flyways, and not just in the Midwest flyway. And then again this fall, it started up as birds started moving south. So that's a change. I think what's also changed is because of the 2015 incident, these flock owners have put lots of priority on their biosecurity. So they've done an excellent job of keeping the disease spread from flock to flock. It's just the challenge that we're going to continue to have, at least for now, with the wild bird populations. I think tomorrow, just a more recent update, tomorrow we'll be in north central Kansas depopulating about 6,000 game birds. This is the second game bird flock that we've had. And I want to put a shout out to KDHE. I don't know if Leo is still here, but we get lots of help. And whenever we do this, usually burial's the preferred method. And so we work with the owner on a site, and then we work with KDHE. And they quickly turn that around on whether that's a good site or where a better site might be. So we take into consideration the long-term environmental impact. So I think tomorrow is the day that we'll be depopulating those, and we're hoping that's the last flock that we have, at least through this stage of the migratory season. With that in mind, probably one of the biggest priorities of the Department of Agriculture is always looking at how we can improve our emergency preparedness, particularly as it relates to foreign animal diseases, in some cases plant health diseases. And in fact, other states, and I think even USDA would tell you that Kansas has spent more time, resources, and made it a bigger priority than practically any other state in always planning for the emergency situation. Next year, I think, will be our 10th anniversary of our week-long exercise where we do planning. You know, we have an incident command. We have a consultant who has a plan in place, like on 9 o'clock you're going to get news about this. Then they come in and tell us at 11 o'clock like it was a real situation. And we've had this year we had about 150 people participate. A lot of the state agencies, private industry, USDA. And when I say state agencies, National Guard, Highway Patrol, Kansas Department of Health and Environment, Kansas Division of Emergency Management, Wildlife and Parks. I'm probably missing somebody, but we get a lot of collaboration. And we had 3 state animal health departments there to observe as well. So it's just like an athletic team. If you have a big victory, if you're smart, you continue to work see how you can improve, and that's our goal, is to always try to improve. I would say, I mentioned earlier wildfires. I've had the privilege to chair or more or less coordinate the wildfire task force that Governor Kelly put together this summer. We had our first meeting in July. We've had 5 meetings. It's a really diverse group. It has local firefighters, volunteer fire representatives of fire departments, emergency preparedness, county commissions, various state agencies, private landowners who've been impacted by wildfires. And I've learned a lot. I learned a lot about the whole structure of emergency management. It's in place for a reason, and how that applies locally. And so we're going to hopefully, it's kind of up to me now to put together a draft report. Representative Probst serves on the committee, and there's 3 other legislators as well. But we've got some tentative recommendations. I've kind of listed those in my comments. But having good data to be able to accurately predict a fire, we've got much better process than we did 5 or 10 years ago. Having more reports of wildfires, there's lots of wildfires. Most of them are small and never reported. But having that data is helpful in many cases, particularly working with FEMA on grants. But the other thing that become clear is probably 80% of our firefighters across the state are volunteer firefighters. And if there's something we could do to provide more support for them, and maybe even more important, provide support and encouragement to their employers who allow them to be a firefighter and give them the time to be training and respond, I think would be very helpful as well. So I look forward to working with the task force to flush out in more detail the recommendations, and we'll provide those hopefully mid-session, long before you go home. I'm excited to talk about local food. Ever since the pandemic, there seems to be a lot of interest by many people to see if they could source some of their food locally. And it's not necessarily just for consumers, but it's provided some entrepreneurial opportunities for individuals to provide that food at a local level. We recently received a grant from USDA. It's called the Local Food Purchase Assistant Cooperative Agreement Program. In essence, we've received $2.5 million. It starts in 2023. And then we allow or encourage farmers who want to grow produce, fruits, provide meat, to register with us. And one of the grant requirements is that the food must go to underserved, underprivileged areas. And we're trying to keep this as low maintenance as possible, so it provided a great opportunity to collaborate with our 3 food banks that reach virtually all across the state. And so we've got that agreement that this money is to go to the food banks to buy the food directly from those farmers. And the food banks are not using overhead at all. They're using dollar for dollar to buy the food. And we think there's a good chance that we'll have an opportunity to apply for a second wave of that. I've got some comments in my prepared remarks about the pet food industry. You'll see that it is one of the top sectors. I don't think a lot of people understand how large it is. It's one of Kansas's big economic drivers because it's a purchaser of many ag products. It's a labor force, and it provides a quality product that in many cases is sold internationally. But we have some pretty major pet food manufacturing interests and entities in the state. I won't go through all that list, but not only do we have several large successful pet food manufacturers, but we have the machinery that makes most of the pet food is actually manufactured here in Kansas at Sabetha. The other thing that's happening out there is USDA has put a lot of emphasis on sustainability, regenerative agriculture, and have put a lot of money out in some grants. In fact, they put forth proposal or asked for proposals for $3 billion in a climate smart commodities grant program. So there were lots of applicants. There's multiple recipients of this, but 20 of those recipients have some type of touch base or in Kansas, and there'll be some of those will be working with our Division of Conservation, essentially providing economic resources and incentives to farmers and ranchers to initiate some of these more regenerative ag practices. Let me close with just a real high update overview on hemp. The legislature in 2018 assigned the Kansas Department of Ag to put forth a research program, which anybody who meets certain qualifications could apply for. And then the 2018 Farm Bill changed that to a commercial hemp program. So Kansas is one of 43 states who operates a hemp program, commercial hemp program. Of course, we have to stay within the guidelines of USDA. But this is our 4th year. We're seeing more interest now in the fiber and the grain than the actual cannabinoid production. For 2022, our acreage, licensed acreage decreased by 33%, but the acres planted increased considerably, and the acres harvest increased. Some of the failures, it's like learning to grow any crop. A lot of the failures deal with germination and drought and lack of adequate irrigation. But we had 61 licensed hemp hemp producers last year. And the other thing that's changed through the legislature was the processing is not in our shop anymore. A couple years ago, they moved it to the state fire marshal, which we were very supportive of, and we collaborate quite closely with them on what we learn on hemp. The only other thing I was going to add that's not in my comments because of some recent news is just a quick update on feral swine. There's been a couple recent media reports about that around the Wichita area, but the legislature has been authorizing or appropriating $150,000 a year that goes to the Kansas Department of Ag for feral swine control. We turn around and contract with USDA's Animal Control Division, and they have people on the ground that follow up on sightings and then put forth the trapping of those hogs. So in 2022, they removed 383 feral pigs. A big portion of these are in Bourbon and Linn counties. So they removed 206 of those in Bourbon and Linn County, and then another 162 in the Cowley-Chautauqua County area. They also reportedly removed about 15 in the Reno and Sedgwick County area. We suspect that those were from illegal translocation from out of state. But when you think about where the populations of feral pigs are, Missouri, Oklahoma, Texas, Arkansas, our program essentially is keeping in check those that migrate into Kansas. And if you look at the numbers from other states, they have a much, much bigger task ahead of them. So we keep it in balance. If we removed 383 pigs this year, and that may seem like a lot of money per pig, but if half of those are gilts and they have 2 litters a year, you can soon figure out what would happen if we didn't. So let me stop there, Mr. Chairman, but it's been a privilege to work with you and maybe get to know more of you during the year. And I look forward to working with the Budget Committee, too, as we go into this in more detail. But I'd be happy to respond to any questions or provide any other additional information.
Okay, Mr. Secretary, thank you. Questions for Secretary Beam? Representative Probst.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Not so much a question. I want to commend the Secretary for his leadership in the Wildfire Task Force. Those have been really authentic conversations about what's going on and what frustrations people have, and he's done good work on that. The other thing I wanted to touch on, because I know it'll be a topic this year, is that in your presentation there's a mention of the GM pilot project in Reno County, and well, it doesn't say Reno County, but it's Reno County because I've been to those farms. I just want to alert to the committee that we'll have conversations this year about ESG, and it seems like a big scary thing. But in Reno County, there's been a lot of money that come down to those farms to help do this research, and nobody that's in that program has been forced to do it. They did it willingly, and they're proud of the work they're doing, and they're getting some incredible data out of that research project.
Well, thank you, and thanks for your service on the task force.
Representative Minix.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary Beam, I really appreciate your comments about water and the agriculture out west over the Ogallala Aquifer. I don't think that anybody studying the water situation in the state of Kansas can separate the economics from it. They are so tightly twined together. I've seen through the last 20 years more and more concentration of cattle feeding, specifically in western Kansas, and also quite a few in the swine operations also. And we have some more dairies coming. And I'm well aware that some of those irrigation areas that were initially started in the 1920s seem to be a lot more wells drilled in the 60s and 70s and 80s. I know they're not producing near the water that they did during those early days, and yet we're providing for far more livestock. The producers out there become as efficient economically as they can through the years. If you look at the trends on a couple of those things, I think it's an amazing success story. And yet I hear from different parts of the state that it would be easy just to shut down the wells in western Kansas. And yet I don't really think that they understand the harm that could come to agriculture. You talk about a few flocks having avian flu and what it's done to the price of eggs. I don't think we dare try to risk what might happen if we try to do the same thing to some of our other agricultural products out there. And I really thank you for your comments earlier, and I guess the best I can say is amen.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I think our challenge is how we can make this look similar to this in the next 25, 50 years. And I try to emphasize is we should be thankful of all the economic activity that's occurred, but it's also those rural communities. If you look at those communities such as Scott City and Garden City and Ulysses, and those are very vibrant communities with hospitals and schools, and it's all related. It's not just the ag economy, it's the social, the cultural, educational aspect of it as well. It's a challenge, but it's one we must take on.
Representative Sheensleepen? Sorry.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Secretary, for being here. I'm going to ask a very pedestrian question because I'm new to this committee and I'm still trying to learn, and I will probably never stop. You talked about one of the needs being public agricultural research. Does that mean we need more funding for public agricultural research? That's question one. And question two is, what is the split between public-private investment, and what does the public investment do as opposed to private investment?
So what I was referring to as public funded research is essentially states and USDA federal dollars. The example that I've heard from is compared to other countries, particularly China, they have ramped up their public funded agricultural research considerably more than we have. But there's the private sector, the companies, they obviously have put a lot of money into research and development. But there's a lot to be gained by having a considerable amount of public funded research at particularly at land-grant universities. It doesn't all have to be at land-grant university. As I know, Wichita State's working on a few projects, but and I think you'll see more discussion about this in the Farm Bill. There's some interest in addressing this in the Farm Bill, federal Farm Bill.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Secretary.
Thank you.
Other questions for the Secretary? As you mentioned in your, talking about sustainability and some things from USDA, as we look at all these different issues, and I think, sustainability goes almost hand in hand with water and some of the things that are being discussed. Has your department done any, looking at some of these federal sources of maybe trying to secure some of those funds or other programs that can work in concert with state, as we look at water conservation, other conservation programs, a lot of that may be out of, your sphere, but I'm guessing most all of those, there might be something that comes back to a state partner.
Well, we have a division of conservation, and I should have talked about that, but they have a very, very strong tie with the county, all the county conservation districts. And Andy Lyon, our division director, he's really eager, and he has stressed to me several times he is looking for opportunities to bring some federal grants that are out there, and we'll be a part of some of those grants that I've mentioned that coming through through USDA. But I think right now there's a lot of interest, not just from the public side, but from the private side in funding some of these efforts, especially if it's going to get on the ground with the farmers and ranchers. So, yes, we have a role in that, particularly as we work with the local conservation districts to roll those out.
Okay. Representative Gardner.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I wanted to just ask a question about the how your assessment about how successful this feral hog containment program has been, and if you had any recommendations to us as far as public policy is concerned, particularly since that seems to be important to protect the integrity of the swine industry. As we've seen in the poultry deal, a lot of backyard poultry is now where we see the avian influenza. I realize with hogs we have different diseases, but we still have the same potential for feral animals to bring in pathogens into the swine industry. And so I wanted to just ask what your assessment of the success of that was, and if there's any need to expand that or possibly bring in other ways of managing that.
Yes, I'm glad you brought that point up, because I didn't mention African swine fever. It's fortunately not in North America. It's close. Those countries that have had the most difficult time of eradicating it usually have a feral swine population. So that, from a disease standpoint, it's very critical to keep it at a minimum, or try to keep it out of not just Kansas, but many of the states that have a lot of pork production. So years ago, it's probably been at least 10 years ago, the legislature passed a bill, which a lot of people shook their heads with at the time, but they passed a bill saying that there's really not going to be legal sport hunting of swine in Kansas. And it seems counterintuitive, because you think, well, that's one way to get rid of them. But what other states have found, and a few states have started to adopt this policy, is if you have a lot of hunting pressure, you just spread them out. And so a landowner, of course, they can shoot them on their property, but you have to get a tag or a permit from our animal health division to shoot them, someone else to shoot them. But because it's not a legal recreational activity, when those clumps or groups show up, and USDA, the trapping systems have really, the technology is pretty amazing. They can pretty much, with experience with baiting, pre-baiting, is they can pretty well get them all in one night in one location. So the biggest challenge, if I could do anything, is wave a wand and have a much more aggressive control program in our neighboring states that would minimize our impact. But we'll be meeting with USDA. I know they feel like they could do even more with more resources, but we've told them that we've got, last 2 years ago we had 125,000. We had to cut it a little bit. And Wildlife and Parks come forward with a one-time 25,000 to kind of shore that up. So I think we can continue at this rate of keeping those in check at that level of funding. I'll talk to them, and we'll see if they can make a good case for a little higher compensation. I lost my train of thought on another thing. anyway, that, I feel good about the success. I mean, I can't imagine how many millions of dollars these other states are spending. They're making some progress, but keeping it. Oh, the other issue is part of the reason we're having issues in some of these places is landowner cooperation. With good reason, they don't go on a place unless they have permission to do so. So in most cases, landowners are cooperative and agreeable to having them come in and trap or remove them with aerial hunting. But if you have a few situations that are harboring the pigs and landowners do not want you on, then you wait till they get off their land, I guess. But it's more difficult. And I'm not here to suggest we change the law on that, but that is a challenge in some cases.
Very good. Last call? Must be close to 5, I said that. Huh? Okay.
One last thing, we've provided the annual Kansas Agriculture Magazine, and we have a considerable input on the content and the stories. We have more over here. And like I told the group this morning, if you've got a dental appointment or a doctor's appointment, throw a couple in your bags and maybe you can leave them in there in the waiting room. But we have more of these if you would have a need for them.
Okay, very good. Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Do appreciate it. And again, if you have other questions afterwards, we can get them to the Secretary and his staff. And Kelsey will also be here several times in the back of the room making faces. So, no, I know. And so we appreciate that. Okay, a few notes. Our next meeting is scheduled for next Tuesday, the 24th. So we will have a presentation from the Kansas Water Authority. I would strongly encourage you, your neighbor, and anybody else you want to see come to this meeting. I think it's going to be interesting. It's not the Water Committee, but it's the next best thing. So Water Authority will have your opportunity to ask questions and next Tuesday. I want to give you some heads up. As you know, we are getting a few bills in. The only thing we're probably going to work next week, that'd be on Wednesday, correct? We'll do the resolution. Yes. On Wednesday, we will be discussing and possibly voting even that day, I'm not sure, there's a joint resolution with the House and Senate dealing with the lesser prairie chicken. And it is supporting the federal delegation that basically is what they have told the EPA and others is that Kansans know how to handle the Kansas situation best. We'll talk more about it then, but primarily in a nutshell, they want to put that on the endangered species list. We did this about a decade ago because of a drought condition. The population went down, the rains returned. The population came back and it wasn't an issue. So it's something that some of us at least want to give the opportunity for our legislature to let our national folks know what's going on. Then also coming up in the days ahead, we are going to have a presentation from Chip Redmond, who's the K-State meteorologist, heads up the K-State Mesonet, talking obviously about weather. That's really what we've talked about a lot, and he has a lot of data and also what the Mesonet can and does provide to folks over the state. Dr. Minton will be here, the Dean of the College of Agriculture, and get an update on all the things going on there as he does every year. Also, we'll have the director of the Kansas State Fair to come in and to talk about some of the things they're doing and some of the improvements and other things that are going on and their ties to agriculture. And then also, we're trying to get a date figured out, and we'll have that pretty soon. Dr. Roger McCohen will come by. He will talk about waters of the U.S. It was released into the Federal Register yesterday. We're still waiting for a Supreme Court ruling, but he's received a lot of attention nationally on that. So to get his take on what this might mean. Also, we're going to talk about foreign ownership of land, farmland especially, and we may work on a concept of a bill there, but we'll talk more about that later. But I wanted to kind of give you all a heads up on some of the things, and then I would guess maybe the end of next week we may work some of these early bills. So I will do one reminder. I already see our committee is getting some mass emails about a bill that's introduced. I would ask one thing, if you want to reply to them, don't hit reply all. Please, do not. If they're not your constituent, you don't know them, either send us say thank you or don't worry about it, okay? That's about as clear as I can say. I'm not getting anybody in trouble, we just don't need that. But well, to reply all, you can sure reply, that's your prerogative, so. Anything else for the good of the cause? Have a great weekend, so no meeting tomorrow. And we will see you all Tuesday at 3:30 for the next House Ag Committee. We are adjourned.